Greetings, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen. There is a language that the world today calls Hebrew, which many people believe to be the one that the ancient Israelites spoke. That language bears many similarities to the Bantu languages of this continent. On account of those similarities, a growing number of people now believe that the ethnic Bantu language speakers of this continent must be descendants of the ancient Israelites. There are legitimate questions, however, as to whether that truly is the language which the ancient Israelites spoke, and if there is not a different explanation for the similarities that it has to Bantu languages. I'd like to share with you today the reason for those questions. Historians tell us that the language which the Bible calls Hebrew was last spoken on this earth sometime in the middle of the 2nd century AD. Only the written form of that language has survived to our present time. At the same time, in the last 100 or so years, a spoken language has emerged in the world, which is also called Hebrew. I will refer to that language as Abyss Hebrew for reasons that will become apparent shortly. The entire vocabulary of the earlier Hebrew is included in that of Abyss Hebrew. That is why it is possible today to read out loud the surviving texts of the earlier Hebrew, including the Bible. The person who came up with Abyss Hebrew was a white man born in Russia who renamed himself Eliezer ben Yehuda, Abi for short. Abi was a prominent member of the group of people who claimed to be descendants of the ancient Israelites, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. This is the same group of people who claim to have created a counterfeit, who created a counterfeit of the biblical Israel outside this continent. In order to come up with his Hebrew, Abi assigned pronunciations or sounds to the words of the earlier Hebrew that had survived in writing. He did not claim to have assigned to those words the same sounds or pronunciations that they had back when the earlier Hebrew was still spoken. What that means is that if, for example, Abraham was to wake up today, he would not be able to follow a conversation that's carried out in Abyss Hebrew. In other words, Abyss Hebrew is a different language from that which Abraham spoke. Abi also added words to his language that were not present in the earlier Hebrew. Many of the words that he added came from a language which is called Aramaic. The Aramaic language that he borrowed words from is very similar to the earlier Hebrew. It is so similar, in fact, that linguistic analysis is often the only way to determine definitively if a phrase is in the earlier Hebrew or in Aramaic. The video which I have linked in the description box below should help you to fully appreciate just how similar that Aramaic was to the earlier Hebrew. The explanation for that similarity is that Hebrew and Aramaic are cousin languages, meaning that they have a common origin, both of them being so-called Semitic languages. That explanation is not surprising. There are no two languages of this earth which are that similar that were never at one time one language. That is another way of saying that no two languages which were never at one time one language can ever be that similar. And that is where the problem lies, because there was never a time when Hebrew and Aramaic were ever one language. The book of Jubilees chapter 12 and verse 25 to 27 reveals that Hebrew is the language which all mankind spoke from the time of Adam until the Tower of Babel fell. When the Tower of Babel fell, the Hebrew language ceased from among the children of men. That is also the time when all the other languages, including Aramaic, began. The first person to speak the Hebrew language again was Abraham himself. Before that, he most likely spoke Aramaic because the Bible describes him as a wandering Aramean. That tells us that the Aramaic language predated the Hebrew language by several hundred years in the post-Tower of Babel world, and could not therefore be an offshoot of the Hebrew language. But the Hebrew language itself could also not be an offshoot of the Aramaic language because it was spoken for several centuries in the pre-Tower of Babel world before Aramaic had even come into existence. That means that any similarities between Aramaic and Hebrew can only be coincidence. But coincidence cannot account for the level of similarity between the Aramaic language and the language that we have for so long been told is Hebrew. And since we know for sure that the language which Abi borrowed words from is Aramaic, the obvious conclusion is that the language to which he added those words cannot possibly be the same language that the Bible refers to as Hebrew. That conclusion should not surprise any of us, because we all should have known that the people who can least be trusted to reveal the true language of the ancient Israelites are the ones who claim to be those Israelites but are not. Why would such a people reveal the true language of the Israelites when they know that that is the surest way to trace the real Israelites and therefore expose them as imposters? Moreover, all of us know that when communities that speak the same language are separated for long enough by time and distance, their languages diverge. So if Hebrew and Aramaic were very similar in the 2nd century AD, why are they still very similar today? Shouldn't Aramaic have drifted away from Hebrew during the 1800 years when it was spoken, but Hebrew was not? The simple truth is this, that the language which for so long we have been told is Hebrew is not actually Hebrew. The true identity of that language becomes clear once an explanation is provided for the similarity that it, as well as Aramaic, have to Bantu languages. But before providing that explanation, allow me to share with you some evidence confirming that the language which the Bible calls Hebrew was significantly different from the Aramaic language. The book of Isaiah chapter 36 and verse 11 reports an incident in which representatives of King Hezekiah of Judah request a commander of the Assyrian army to address them in Aramaic. The circumstances of that request tell us that Hebrew and Aramaic were sufficiently different that a person who understood Hebrew could not follow a conversation that's carried out in Aramaic. Secondly, according to the letter of Aristeas, bringing people in from Judea to translate the Hebrew scriptures was justified because those scriptures were not in the Aramaic language. That tells us that Aramaic was sufficiently different from Hebrew that a person who was literate in Aramaic could not translate a writing that was in Hebrew. Aramaic was the language of a region which the Old Testament refers to as Aram. This is the same region which the New Testament calls Syria, and that is why the Aramaic language is also called Syriac. The video on this channel, titled Biblical Israel is in Central Africa, reveals where exactly the region which the Bible calls Syria actually was. As it turns out, it is the same region where the Bantu languages originated from. It is no wonder then that the language which we have for so long been told is Hebrew bears such similarity to the Bantu languages of this continent. It is the original Bantu language because evidently Bantu languages all originated from the biblical Aram. In other words, the language that we have for so long been told is Hebrew is not actually Hebrew, it is Aramaic. The language that Abi borrowed words from is nothing more than a variant of the Aramaic language. And as is the case with all languages, different variants are so similar that linguistic analysis is often the only way to tell them apart. Aramaic shares more than just a common origin with Bantu languages. Like Bantu languages today, it once was the most widely spoken language on this continent. The book of Daniel chapter 2 and verse 4, for example, reveals that the wise men who King Nebuchadnezzar challenged to interpret his dream answered the king in Aramaic. The letters which were addressed to the Persian king Artaxerxes and which are reported in the book of Ezra chapter 4 and verse 7 were also written in Aramaic. And in case you're wondering, the places which in the Bible which English translators rendered in the Bible as Babylon and Persia are both on this continent. The request to address them in Aramaic, which representatives of King Hezekiah made to a commander of the Assyrian army, confirms to us that there were in Israel as well as in Assyria people who understood the Aramaic language. And we can tell from the letter of Aristeas that had the sacred writings of the ancient Israelites been in the Aramaic language, then it would not have been necessary to bring translators in from Judea, presumably because Aramaic was well enough understood in ancient Egypt. This is confirmed by the large number of papyri that were written in the Aramaic language that were found in Egypt at a place called Elephantine. Hebrew began or restarted with one person several hundred years after Aramaic became a language. Therefore, it was too minor of a language to have flipped positions with Aramaic to become the dominant language of this continent that Bantu languages are today. In conclusion, therefore, the claim that ethnic Bantu language speakers of this continent are descendants of the ancient Israelites cannot be sustained on the basis of the similarity of their languages with the language which the ancient Israelites spoke, because the only similarities which have been established are between their languages and that of the biblical Aram. Many thanks for your time and attention, and have a great day.